Welcome, everybody. We are ready to begin. I wanted to welcome everyone to this Virginia Theological Seminary Center for Anglican Communion Studies Lunchtime Forum. This is the first Lunchtime Forum of our academic year. My name is Hartley Wensing. I'm Associate Director of the Center. I want to welcome those in the room, and I believe with a little technical work, we are able to connect with those watching on Facebook Live as well. So welcome to you virtually. For those who might be new to the center, we exist to support the Anglican Communion by providing educational opportunities, by training leaders, and by providing opportunities for connection and gathering. I want to give a quick plug for one easy way you can stay engaged with the communion in the center. The companions of the Center for Anglican Communion Studies. Pick up a brochure or look for information on our Facebook page or web page. It's an easy way to join in deep conversations like these about Anglicanism and be offered exciting opportunities in return. There is no cost to join the companions, and if you attend 3 center events in a year, you'll be invited to our annual companions dinner with a notable speaker. Please take a moment also to look at our programming for the fall on our event card or on Eventbrite to see the events that we have coming up this year. This is our 25th anniversary year at the center, and our theme is loving neighbors near and far. Since we know not everybody can make these sessions, we are recording the public part of our discussion today so that others can access it later. Over the course of this academic year, we will be doing scriptural reasoning. We've actually already started with an event last week, and we'll be hosting communion sabbatical visitors and leading thinkers. Today, of course, we focus on this summer's Lambeth Conference. And as our speakers, we are delighted to welcome VTS Dean and President Ian Markham, Ebony Davis, Associate for Programming and Historical Research for Reparations in the VTS Office of Multicultural Ministries, and Center for Anglican Communion Studies Director Catherine Grebe. We are going to hear short opening reflections from each person, followed by some discussion questions between them. Then we're going to end our live stream and have an opportunity for further discussion with our participants here in the room. At this point, I'll ask Dr. Grebe to begin with opening statements.
Thank you so much, Hartley, and welcome to those in the room and those joining us online. I want to begin with a very brief history of the Lambeth Conference. On your table, there should be a handout marked History of the Lambeth Conference, which you may want to resource while I am lifting out a few highlights from it. It helps to just remind ourselves what the Anglican Communion is and is not, and what the Lambeth Conference is about and for. The Anglican Communion is not itself a church, but it is a body made up of member churches, each of which is part of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church of Jesus Christ. These member churches are autonomous. That means they are self-governing, and they are, each one is free to order and regulates its affairs through its own system of government and law. But the Anglican Communion, ever since 1867, has enjoyed as one of the things that bind it together and keep the bonds of affection between its member churches, the Lambeth Conference. So called because the first of these conferences in 1867 was held at Lambeth Palace near London by then Archbishop of Canterbury Charles Longley, and was held there until 1978, when it got too big for that, and so the Lambeth Conference moved to Canterbury. Why Canterbury? Because Canterbury Cathedral is the mother church of the Anglican Communion, and Canterbury is the see that affiliation with which is one of the defining marks of the Anglican communion. You're an Anglican if you are in communion with the Archbishop of the See of Canterbury. The reason I'm stressing that is because that means that Anglicanism did not begin in 1534 when the Pope denied Henry VIII's request for an annulment of his marriage. Even 597, when St. Augustine was sent by the Pope sent to London, but landed in Canterbury and found Queen Bertha already worshiping at St. Martin's Church near the cathedral back in 597. And even before that, there's a strand of English Anglicanism in England, first from left by the Roman, under Christians under the Roman Empire in the 2nd century, and then continuing up in the northern part of England, Ireland, Scotland with the Celtic saints. So there's a long-standing tradition of Anglicanism in England, and the Lambeth Conference is one of the 4 instruments, or one focus of unity, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and 3 instruments of communion, the Lambeth Conference, the Anglican Consultative Council, and the Primates Meeting, that is charged with bringing the communion closer together by its work, by convening bishops to confer, to pray together, to worship together, to exchange ideas. It's not a legislative body, although for a good part of its history it has passed resolutions. These resolutions are suggestive rather than binding, and it's easy to forget that when it's called a resolution, but it is very important to remember that. So, brief history of the Lambeth Conference and its place in the Anglican Communion. This most recent Lambeth Conference was held at the end of July, last week of July, and the first week of August. And you've probably already read a good bit about it in the news media. As always, there have been and there will be multiple readings of its significance, of what happened there, what it means. But a few things seem to be clear. One is that there is a qualitative change in the style of Lambeth conferences this time, partly because of what happened at the Lambeth Conference in 2008, the last Lambeth Conference, which was primarily a retreat time following the somewhat contested and bitter results of the Lambeth 1998. So a qualitative change in style of the Lambeth Conference, partly as a result of the bishops' conversations that preceded it. This was a set-up pattern of many bishops meeting by Zoom over a series of meetings to prepare themselves for Lambeth Conference, to prepare themselves to meet one another. They did Bible studies together. They had conversations that prepared them to be bishops in conversation at Lambeth. And the role of the Lambeth Conference has been clarified substantially as a result of this Lambeth Conference. There's still some confusion about this. There was, at the beginning of the conference, the calls that were sounded looked at first very much like resolutions with a different name, and there were only possibilities at the beginning to either affirm them or to say that more study was needed before they could be affirmed. But the Archbishop of Canterbury and his team demonstrated impressive leadership in their ability to pivot on the nature of those calls, with several important outcomes resulting from that. One is typified by a recent comment by a bishop that just this morning we were talking about Lambeth Conference. He said he used to understand the Lambeth Conference as a historic link to the past, but now he understands it as an ongoing instrument of cohesion and community building. Another result of and I think that sentiment is much more widely spread than just one or two bishops, as a result of the work that has happened at this Lambeth Conference. Another result is, at least in my opinion, the clear failure of the Global South Fellowship of Anglican Churches, GSFA, that sounded a call to the Orthodox Christians attending Lambeth Conference. This call went out in early July, defining itself as seeking to be and being part of the holy remnant that God has preserved in the Anglican Communion, and calling on fellow Anglicans who defined themselves as Orthodox Anglicans not to participate in some of the events at Lambeth Conference, I think particularly the Eucharist. What happened towards the end of the Lambeth Conference was that some bishops from the Global South, primates from the Global South, said to this group, or about this group, actually we can speak for ourselves. We don't need GSFA to speak for us, or GSFA doesn't speak for all of us, we speak for ourselves. Another important result of this particular Lambeth Conference was the Archbishop of Canterbury's comment that he had no intention of disciplining anyone. This was in response to pressure from that group and others. And finally, for the first time, language about the issue of same-sexuality was straightforward, was truthful. That there is more than one theological position in the Anglican Communion on this topic. There is the majority position, clearly stated in Lambeth 1998 Resolution 110, saying that marriage can only be between a man and a woman. And there is also a minority view that has been around for a long time and is actually growing in support, that suggests that there are other ways of thinking about this issue than that one. This is the first time there has been acknowledgement, public acknowledgement by the Archbishop of Canterbury in the context of a Lambeth Conference that there is more than one theologically responsible, carefully thought through, and faithful position to be held. One side effect of the last several comments is that it may be possible again for theologians from the Episcopal Church to serve once more on ecumenical and theological commissions of the Anglican Communion. It has not been possible. I am one of several people who was asked to resign, who was resigned actually, from the Unity, Faith, and Order Commission because of being part of the Episcopal Church, and as a result of some decisions we have made. So that may be a minor point, but it's what it means for the as a whole is, in my view, a major step forward. Let me turn now to Ebony Davis and ask you to make some comments about Lambeth.
Good afternoon, everyone. Oh,
Yeah,
It's
just
not on.
bring that nearer to you, and then this will be to you.
it's not on.
It's not on?
I don't think
Okay,
so.
let's do one green light.
Good afternoon, everyone. So I attended the VTS dinner that was hosted roughly halfway through the Lambeth Conference. And there I spoke about our reparations program. In brief, I shared a little bit of the history of the program, how long we've been in action, if you will, and recognized the number of shareholders and the number of descendants that are participating in the program, one of which joins us here today. I'm not going to put him on the spot, but he's right there. And talked about what our program kind of does, but then I fully went into a different direction and explored reparations and the global aspect of it, the calls for reparations globally, both individually and collectively throughout history. And I felt that this very important history was necessary as we sat in a room where leaders, church leaders, and influential figures were gathered from just about every corner of the world in the Anglican communion. And so, looking at that, what does that mean to kind of talk about that history? I talked about how what we're doing in our program, as amazing as it is, it's not new. It's not particularly something that is a result of, a benevolent white institution. Reparations as a whole has a history. It falls in line with a legacy of calls from Black people globally who have been taking to task the institutions and the nations that have oppressed and enslaved them since the end of slavery in their particular societies. And so what I get to do every day in my job is fall in line with that wonderful legacy of self-determination and self-advocacy, where Black people are holding these institutions to task and getting results. And so what we do in the program just is a small part of speaking to that. I also stress the importance of both the moral and the material nature of reparations, as within our program, not only do we issue payments, but we also want to go into relationships with the descendants. And I find when I hear it discussed that some people lean into one part, the relationships, more than the other, or really lean into the material, which is the money, the payment aspect, more than the other. But I think it's important to know that those things are together. You cannot repair with just the I'm sorry. You have to take some kind of material aspect. You cannot repair with just writing a check and then sending someone on the way. So it has to be that moral and material, those two pieces need to go hand in hand. And so I always try to make sure people understand that. It's when they say, oh, it's not about the money, the relationship's important. No, it's about the money, absolutely. And it's about the relationships, absolutely. Together, that is how we are able to begin to repair and start new with our program. And so that's the work that I shared at the dinner. It's interesting to know, I wonder how my words landed in a space like that with a group that was that diverse. It's a compliment to CACS on how so many people were gathered there. But I did kind of walk away wondering, how are people going to take what was shared home and apply it in their context? Can they take what was shared and apply it in their context? And I think, circling back, that's not as important as the fact that I was able to share. And that circles it back to what we do in the program. We can't be attached to the outcome or how it's received by the public. We're trying to attempt to right a wrong to a certain group of people, and how they receive it and how our words and our actions land with them is the only thing that matters. And so keeping that a priority, even in the context of speaking at a conference, I found that quite important.
Dean Markham.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. It's lovely to see you all here. And thank you, fellow panelists. To give you a question that I would be tempted to ask Ebony if I were you, is this. Is it true that a primate came and knelt before you at the end of her presentation at the Lambeth dinner? And you can save that question up and she can decide whether she wants to answer it or not. Okay, so Lambeth, it was hot. It was really hot. Now, I'm a Brit, and I know that the weather shouldn't be hot in England. It's supposed to be cloudy and wet. It wasn't. It was really, really, really hot. And it's weird. There's Canterbury, which is a sort of, little town, really, in the middle. And then the University of Kent, and there's a big distance between the two. And no taxis work, right? So you can't get back and forward. So the big thing for me in this Lambeth was I learned how to use a scooter. One of those scooters, and make my way up and down rather precariously.
And why didn't we get a photo of the
No, exactly.
Why didn't we get
I'm relieved that all photos have been destroyed of that momentous occasion. There are lots of reasons why Virginia Theological Seminary is present in Lambeth. We have a deep connection with the Anglican Communion. Bishop Mark Dyer was on the Windsor Report. Reverend Dr. Kathy Grieve was on the Anglican Covenant group. And Robert Heaney was part of the design group for Lambeth, what should have been 2018, but ended up being 2022. So we've got these deep connections. And for me, one of the reasons why it's so important is because so often we make our God really small. You know, we sort of imagine that our congregation is basically it. Those are all the Christians there are in the world. And if we manage to transcend that, we might imagine that the Episcopal Church is it. You know, we're all the Christians in the world. And we sort of lose the sense that actually the God we worship is the God of the whole world. And the God we worship is a God that actually has raised up and is transforming human lives throughout this world of ours. And this connection with the Anglican Communion is fundamental, because it's something that we need to constantly remind ourselves about, that we're in a church that's global, and it is enormous variety and enormous difference, and we celebrate that and live into it and get shaped by it. Another dimension to all this is we do the hard work of service. You know, so we're very fortunate here at Virginia Theological Seminary. We're an institution that sits on a significant endowment as an institution. And the temptation all the time is we can find 1,000,001 ways to put all our resources into keeping our operation going. But the communion is a reminder that, you know, we have an obligation, a stewardship responsibility to take what we have and make it available to others. And that's like, you know, a primary theme of the Gospels, especially Luke's Gospel. So we take that seriously in our service. But it's more important than just service too. It's also learning from. We allow ourselves to be shaped by the thoughts and reflections and contributions of other Christians serving elsewhere in the world. And of course, what the Lambeth Conference is a very visible reminder of is that, you know, Anglicanism is strongest in Africa. So, you know, we have a perception in this country that it's predominantly a white denomination, but we get this reality check that we're part of a tradition that's taken root everywhere in the globe and is especially strong in Africa. Going to be the status of Lambeth 110. We are, as a seminary, deeply committed to the full inclusion of LGBT plus persons, and that's part of our witness and our obligation in the communion. And we were therefore sensitive to what the messaging of this particular Lambeth would be. But we're also equally committed to a faith that we share with those who disagree with us. We love the Lord Jesus. We believe in the triune God. We think the creeds are true. And we're committed to conversation. I have a little mantra that we talk to anybody willing to talk to us, which I know is something that Dr. Greaves is very committed to and has made part of the witness of CAGS. And therefore, we had to navigate that. And to be honest, it was slightly disruptive because at least one of the two events we hosted coincided with a meeting of the North American bishops to discuss the issue of Lambeth 110 being reaffirmed in one of the calls. So we had to navigate some of the immediate local complexities of the occasion. But overall, as I reflect on the journey, I think Virginia Theological Seminary's presence there is important. It's important because it's a witness to the importance of theological education. We think it's important people learn. It's important because it builds countless connections where our guests who from elsewhere in the communion can come and be here and enjoy the campus, enjoy the library, enjoy the refectory, enjoy our guest housing. In fact, it's lovely to see Dr. Richard Sudworth, so give us a wave please, who serves on the Archbishop of Canterbury's staff, responsible for ecumenical and interfaith relations. He will correct the distortion of his position interfaith. So it's lovely that he's with us. And, you know, that is, as many of the students know, one of the coolest things about being at Virginia Theological Seminary, especially if you are willing to walk into the refectory and sit with somebody other than just your friends, is you can plonk yourself in front of Richard, and you suddenly find you're talking to somebody who not only was at Lambeth, not only at the heart of what was going on, but plays a very important role as we navigate living and being faithful Christians in the world in which we're called to serve. So overall, I am just very, very pleased with this Lambeth Conference, with the work that we did there, and I'm very, very pleased with the hard work of the Centre for Anglican Communion Studies and the staff, and the work of institutional advancement. So thank you.
Thank you. We have some follow-up discussion. The mic, thanks. Thank you, Hartley. There's a little bit of follow-up discussion among ourselves for a minute, then we're going to throw the conversation open to your comments and questions. A question first to you, Ebony. I do hope you'll revisit the question that the Dean put on the table. But let me just ask you this. Technology sometimes is more of a foe than a friend, and we know that while planning the VTS dinner, you were told that a video presentation was not possible, so you left most of your files home, and then suddenly got there and was told at the last minute, it is possible. Thinking quickly, you shared a powerful video from the Descendants' formal dinner here, and can you say a little bit more about that decision? You've said a little bit about why it's important to tell the reparations story at the Lambeth Conference, but why is it important for people to hear that story, even if they didn't grow up in Virginia?
Specifically with the video, I thought that was the best way to really translate what the program is about, and like those intangible pieces of the work that we do that you can't quite see, but you can feel. And so in June, we had a Descendants gathering, and it was about 200, maybe a little bit more descendants in the refectory. Likely the most Black people gathered on campus ever, honestly. And
The pictures.
the one thing, yes, the one thing I regret from that night is I didn't call the names of all of the people who were bound here on this campus, or who labored here during slavery and worked here under segregation during Jim Crow. Something that I try to do all the time. I want to say their names out loud with reverence and honor and respect and care, because it's likely when they were here, nobody was talking to them in that kind of way. And I just, in the mix of the evening, I didn't do that. And so when we had an opportunity to take the footage from that evening, I used it as a chance to speak those names. And so there's a voiceover of the names being called with just video images from the evening. And I think I could talk about the program all day and night and tell you how great it is and how beautiful these families were and how impactful the work that we're doing is, and how it doesn't even begin to kind of sort of make up for all the harm, but it's one little small step. Or I could show this video that just translates all of that without there being a word spoken. And so that was the motivation behind that decision, that last minute decision that really came together. And I think it shared the reality of how transformative doing reparative work can be.
And just what happened with Archbishop Strange of Scotland?
So yes, he did come and kneel. That feels very, he got on his knees before me, I don't know. But his name is Archbishop Mark Strange, and within the program we have the Strange family, and they are descendants of Archie and Leon Strange, who worked both here at the seminary and at Episcopal High School. And that family is part of the program, a very active part of the program. You'll probably see Mr. Strange coming to lunch every now and then. Very, very tall guy. And this bishop all the way from Scotland has the same last name. And so when he heard that name called in the video, afterwards he came up to me and said, I fear that my family may have one time owned this family, because Strange is an uncommon name in Scotland. And so it's an even more uncommon name here in Virginia. And while there are Scots in Virginia, there are not Strange Scots. And so he just wanted to know what that connection might be, what we knew about our Strange family. And as he has been embarking on some family history research of his own. And so presently, one of the research members of our research team, she's in Scotland right now. She had a family vacation already planned. And so when I shared this story with our research team, she said, well, I'm going to Scotland next month. What are the chances that I can meet with him? And so they're meeting. And we're going to continue this history and see what connections might be there between the Strange family that lives in Alexandria, Virginia, and Inverness, Scotland?
Mhm.
Okay. So, yes, that's true.
Yeah.
And that's probably one of the most memorable moments from that evening.
Yeah, good. I was going to ask you, that was my last question for you, this was your first Lambeth Conference. Aside from that, were there other memorable parts of your experience there that you take away and bring back with you from Lambeth Conference?
The short answer is yes. Yes. One that probably doesn't have much to do with Lambeth is I got to see Bishop Chilingani and his wife Pindo, who are really dear friends of mine from Tanzania. And when I was at Enchilada in February of 2020, right before COVID, I was there with Pindo Chilingani. And we led a women's conference, or I think they call it a clergy spouse conference. And then COVID came and kind of ravaged through the world. Right. And so to see them again and to see them doing well and to be able to just have that moment was probably the best.
Mm-hmm. It can be a reunion of old friends.
Absolutely.
Amazing. Let me turn my attention now to a question for Dean Markham. Virginia Theological Seminary was not only the one Episcopal seminary from the United States to be present at the marketplace at Lambeth, where all the networks of the Anglican Communion had booths, but the only seminary from the Anglican Communion as a whole. And that was noticed by a number of people who visited our booth, commented on. Can you say a little bit more about your vision for the role that VTS is currently playing in the Anglican Communion, and what it might become, and why any of this matters?
I mean, we are, in many ways, a seminary that has the capacity to be present, and I take the view that we have, therefore, an obligation to be present. And I think it matters because the communion is a very important part of our identity as Anglicans and as part of the Episcopal Church. We aspire to be a global family, recognizing deep connections with the rest of the world, and that has been part of our history. You know, the Anglican Church in Japan was a result of an alumnus of Virginia Theological Seminary learning Japanese and settling there and actually dying in Japan. And the Anglican Church in Brazil is a result of our labours in the 19th century. And now we continue those connections and responsibilities to build up the church and our witness in this globe. And we do so because I think the Episcopal Church in particular needs to do this, partly because we always need to be attentive to what we can learn from Christians elsewhere in the globe, and partly because I think we are bringing an Anglicanism that's committed to inclusivity, that is part of our important witness that we in return offer others. And it's interesting you alluded to Bishop Dixon. So Bishop Dixon runs now, you've got to be always careful with numbers, but, approximately 500,000 Anglicans in one diocese in central Tanganyika in Tanzania. So a very significant bishop, influential both in Tanzania and beyond, who has a deep relationship which expresses itself in friendship with Ebony. That is actually part of why we do all this. Mm-hmm. It is the work of getting to know Christians elsewhere, building bridges, being in conversation, seeking to understand where others are coming from, and seeking to serve. And that's, I think, part of our obligation, and in a very real sense is the successor to our more traditional missionary outreach of the 19th century.
Thank you. We should do a shout out to a book by William Sachs, primarily on this history, that's just going to press tomorrow, I think,
Right.
In time for our 200th anniversary. And to also, when we're thinking about the Anglican Communion, some people have tied it entirely to the progress of the British Empire. And we, as a nation that has also had an empire of a very similar kind, have other kinds of reparations work to do and things to undo, understandings and assumptions to unlearn, things to repent of, and it's instructive to think about how to begin again in relationships that were at least in our case were in many ways seriously flawed, but also not to throw out the baby with the bathwater, and to recognize the way that these lasting relationships are in place because of that history. As much as it needs to be interrogated, it's still very important. But let me stop talking and ask you something else. You're regularly connected with seminary deans, primates, and other bishops and other communion leaders. What are you hearing about the results of this Lambeth Conference and what difference it will make? What's the word on the street at your level?
So it is true, yes. I'm in frequent conversation with leaders, especially in theological education, but also bishops of the Episcopal Church. And I think your read right at the beginning was actually very important for us as a key takeaway. And that is, I think you had the season from basically 1998 to the emergence of GAFCON. That was the season when, the bonds of affection were really strained, and there was endless talk about how do we get the Episcopal Church out of the communion, and you were responsible for that famous line, "You can check in but you can't check out," alluding to the Eagles Hotel California. So, with that stage one. Now stage two, I think, is there's recognition that we still fundamentally disagree, but there's a deeper commitment to conversation and recognizing the integrity of the position of the other. So I do think it was a pivotal Lambeth in that respect. I think I'm less worried than I was in 2007, 2008, 2010, that the Anglican communion might disintegrate, or you needed a new structure to put in its place, or ACNA will become the official form of Anglicanism on these shores. All that sort of talk, I think, is dissipated, and now there's a fundamental recognition of integrity. And I must admit, I think the Church of England will now find it easier to perhaps move to a position of more inclusivity because of this growing understanding that you can be in conversation with Canterbury and at the same time hold different positions on the issue of human sexuality. So I come out of it actually more hopeful, and I think that's my read of bishops certainly. Seminary deans, they vary. We reflect the spectrum of Anglicanism in this country. But I am sort of more hopeful that there's a commitment to conversation and living with difference rather than, and that's actually pretty countercultural these days, because most of us can't manage that. So I think it was, on the whole, a hopeful Lambeth, and I think it's been received as such.
Thank you. And thanks to those who have joined us on Facebook. We're ending our public conversation here, and we look forward to seeing all of you at our next event.